There's nothing like being in the stands cheering on your favorite team, and the Game Time app gives fans the advantage. Digital cues and prices jumping at checkout can get in the way of you and a great seat. Game Time is your hack to unlocking amazing tickets in just a few taps. It's easy to use, and the Game Time guarantee means you can trust you'll get 100% authentic tickets at the best price. Fees are always included, so what you see is what you pay. You can snag new ticket deals before anyone else by following your favorite teams, or get a panoramic view of the view from your seat, all right from the app. Plus, you can save even more with zone deals by choosing a section and letting Game Time choose the seats. No matter what, your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying sports tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app and create an account to start searching for tickets to upcoming games and events. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Game Time.
The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
Neither of us spoke as we both let our emotions recede. And yet, his description of the stall injury was a revelation. It all came together. Ward had been interviewed by the FBI and Anne Hagdorn Auerbach and had testified at trial. Here, in plain language, was an explanation of how Alydar died, by someone intentionally breaking his leg and not leaving a trace. From Broken, The Suspicious Death of Alydar and the End of Horse Racing's Golden Age by Fred Kray. Well, welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. This is episode 96, Legacy, on Broken, The Suspicious Death of Alydar and the End of Horse Racing's Golden Age by Fred Kray, Part 4, Second Cast. Since we first began Broken, it has been a rough ride. Alydar is euthanized after suffering a broken cannon bone in his right rear leg. While at first there was acceptance that Alydar had kicked the stall door, rumors and suspicions rise after Calumet declares bankruptcy. J.T. Lundy had run Calumet Farm into the ground, utterly destroying a great thoroughbred racing horse dynasty. Jailed for conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and bank fraud, Calumet had utterly been decimated. During Lundy's sentencing hearing, federal prosecutor Julia Tamala makes the case that Lundy was responsible for the death of Alydar, with Judge Sim Lake acknowledging there was suspicion, motive, opportunity, and evidence, but they were, quote, unable to conclude by a preponderance of the evidence that Mr. Lundy is responsible for the death of Alydar, end quote. Thus, the trials were over, and you'd think the book would end here. But no. We are delving into Fred Kray's investigation, stemming from the pure love he has for Alydar and his passion to get to the truth. The question remains, was Alydar a victim of a freak accident, or had something entirely malicious occurred, the intentional death of an elite horse worth millions in insurance money? But we're not quite done with J.T. Lundy. Not long after his conviction, the news broke that Lundy was attempting to get a pardon from President Clinton by offering to secretly share profits from a Venezuelan mining venture with Roger Clinton, brother of the president. No pardon was granted. Forever a lowlife, Lundy learned nothing. He's still using bribery to mitigate his actions, taking no responsibility for ruining Calumet, for the frauds committed, the conspiracy, and blamed everybody else for his fall from the height of luxury in society that he never earned. From plotting to marry 16-year-old Cindy Wright to Alydar's death, this man was ruthless, reckless, intolerant, money hungry, living lavishly like Calumet withered on the vine. He is a pathetic man. And now, our author, Fred Kray, launches his own investigation. He explains, quote, I spent the latter part of my career defending animals who cannot speak for themselves. I loved Alydar and felt he had been greatly wronged. End quote. This is a good man, and his dedication warms my heart. While reading all the news accounts, magazine stories, books, getting copies of court transcripts and pleadings, Fred settled down to study. Finding everyone involved, who was hopefully still alive after 30 years, was a rather daunting task. He began with Alton Stone. Fred managed to get him on the phone, but he reacted badly, angry and reluctant to talk. He spat out that he didn't know what happened to Alydar and that he loved that horse, and this was truly palatable through the phone. Fred realized that Alton was nursing a wound that had never healed properly. He said, quote, this is a nightmare for me. It's over and done with, and that's that, end quote. And Fred kindly accepted this. Moving on to John Ward. Fred Kray hoped he'd open up 30 years later. So the two men sat down, with Kray noting that John had changed little, save for a few more white hairs on his head. Looking back, John Ward was as surprised as everyone else that Calumet was in debt and dying. He estimated that approximately $600 million had been mismanaged. Ward totally believed that Lundy had squirreled away money, probably somewhere in Venezuela. Venezuela again, huh? Getting to Alydar and the insurance, Ward explained that Alydar's breeding rights had been sold for 3 years into the future already, so there was no cash coming in. Their choices were grim. Quote, there's 2 scenarios that could play out, and they chose the one where the horse dies. This is 5-6 months after I was there. I went to the stallion barn, and they showed me exactly what transpired. End quote. Now, this is really disturbing, so brace yourselves. Ward told Fred what happened to Alydar. Quote, they stood the horse against the wall, facing to the back of the stall. They took his leg, and they opened the door, held his hind leg out, and pushed the door closed, and let him struggle. And he turned upside down and broke it. It was a Chinese finger puzzle, end quote. Well, Kray was not prepared for this blow-by-blow description of how Alydar was intentionally maimed, and Ward got into the details. Quote, someone would be in the stall with the horse, holding the horse with his butt against the door. There was a couple of them, and made him panic, end quote. Kray asked why Alydar would let them do this. In spite of those who insisted Alydar was high-strung and temperamental, Ward explained that this horse was a good horse. They'd have put a lip chain on him and waited till the leg broke. Quote, this horse would have struggled, and it would have been a struggle that was probably a duration of 5 to 10 minutes, end quote. This cruelty, the brutality, is just difficult to imagine. This beautiful chestnut horse who had been pampered and loved always. And yet it did make a kind of terrible sense, given the evidence. Ward was resigned, accepting that this is what happened. Quote, as far as kicking the stall door and shearing those pins that go into the concrete, the door would have just been unbelievably marred on the inside, end quote. And it certainly was not, given the photographic evidence. Remember the little hook and eye door latch I told you to remember from episode 91? Well, that was working just fine when Tom Dixon arrived at Alydar's stall within an hour or so of the injury. Well, this is why. Ward also said, quote, you see the latch, that goes across? Now, my other question to you is, how's that little latch going to stay closed if this accident happens as Larry said it did? End quote. Referring to Dr. Larry Bramlage, the expert veterinarian. Stricken, Kray gravely agreed that the latch would have also broken. And it was not. A feeble hook and eye latch had withstood a mighty rear kick by Alydar? No way. And know that I have streamlined a lot of this because I sobbed my eyes out reading it. The terror was just so raw and so stark. So if you really want to get all into this, you have to read Fred's book yourself to get the details from his exemplary investigation here. This was just really difficult. Well, how did this scenario line up with Dr. Larry Brambridge's description? Well, Ward knew that Brambridge was a savvy politician, and he was not going to let himself get dragged into a controversy, and he was just going to stick with the entanglement theory. And with his reputation, no one would publicly disagree with him. Brambridge insisted Alydar caught his leg, twisted, fell, and breaking it. But the unanswered question remains, how did the horse get into that position? And Ward had told Fred Kray exactly what he believed happened. Now, I believe that Dr. Brambridge had repeatedly publicly stated the entanglement theory, and to backtrack now, to admit his expert opinion was wrong, that he may have been schnookered, was simply beyond his capabilities, putting his reputation before the truth of what may have happened to Alydar. Did Ward think that Stone was involved? Alton Stone was a solid worker, but he could be pressured. Ward said, quote, "As far as him lying, I could see him doing that," end quote. Sounds like a strong maybe to me. Well, what about Alydar being a kicker? Well, Ward did not know firsthand, but everybody who knew him said that Alydar was quiet in his stall. So none of this made any sense to Ward. Quote, "For a horse to kick and break, to do what they said he did, there would have been such a massive indentation in the wood frame of the stall, you would see where it happened. Wood absorbs the blow. It leaves an indentation," end quote. And with that, Ward pulled the plug on the interview. But he had shared the first realistic explanation of how Alydar was intentionally injured, a valid explanation. Kray was filled with the injustice of it all, how Alydar had been used, abused, and killed over greed. Well, next, find more witnesses that are willing to talk to a man with no journalistic or writing background, not connected to the thoroughbred industry, and who had never written a book before. Well, that's going to be a steep climb. Kray knew that judges and lawyers were constrained by attorney-client privilege, so he just skipped them. Prosecutor Julia Tamala never returned his call, but Alton Smith's defense attorney, Christopher Goldsmith, did agree to talk. Now, Goldsmith said in hindsight that Cowboy Kip being off that night was weird. If it was intentional, Kip was moved out of the way with Stone stepping in as the night watchman for a reason, and whoever had made sure that Stone did not know the reason. Goldsmith felt that Stone would definitely miss that which the regular guy would notice was out of place. And I have to say, I thought about that too when I was reading this. What about Goldsmith's witnesses? Still dejected, he explained that a lot of folks would not talk to him, with J.T. Lundy on top of the list. He had tried to subpoena Lundy, but it just didn't pan out, and you could hear the lingering bitterness in his tone. But Goldsmith was still bound by attorney-client privilege, so nothing further was shared. Gary Matthews, the former CFO of Calumet, who knew about all the financial misdeeds going on and was convicted with Lundy, as we saw last episode. After the fraud trial, Matthews was quoted as saying, "I can't imagine him doing something so drastic as to kill his best horse. JT loved animals, but he was in a desperate situation. I remembered we discussed that if First City debt was cut in half, the Japanese would be far more interested in investing. Maybe he thought this was the thing to do," end quote. Well, sounds like Gary Matthews has his doubts. So Fred Kray called Gary Matthews saying he was writing a book on Alydar, and the man got huffy and hung up on him. Okay. Well, Fred Kray did speak with John Veach, Alydar's trainer. While passionate that Alydar was not an aggressive horse, Veach was adamant that there was no way Alydar, alone in his stall, would kick hard enough to break a leg. That kind of injury, breaking a cannon bone, happens out in the field or in training, never in a stall. As for Dr. Brambridge, He had never treated Alydar before, so what did he know of the horse's temperament? He was treating Alydar with a broken leg in intense pain. Veach said Bramblage was, quote, basically reiterating what somebody had told him. He's working on a hypothesis. He was not going to involve himself in research on how it really happened, end quote. And Bramblage was under pressure to explain what happened. Then he took the safe way out for himself, the neutral, politically safe route. Kray asked Veach what he thought of the entanglement theory. Quote, it was almost physically impossible to do. Having worked around these doors and seeing how they operate, and knowing the demeanor of Alydar, it was not probable, end quote. Now, Veach makes his position very clear. Quote, his leg was broken on purpose for the insurance money, end quote. But while these are sincerely held beliefs, Veach didn't have any evidence beyond his personal experience working at Calumet. Well, in January 2019, Lexington, Kentucky, after playing phone tag while working hard to build some trust, Fred Kray met with Tom Dixon, the Lloyd's insurance adjuster. Now, Fred's goal was to get copies of Dixon's documentation and photographs. What became clear in Kray's conversation with Dixon is that the man was drinking the Kool-Aid. Tom knew the folks at Calumet. He knew the farm's history. He believed in the posh, manicured lawns, the beautiful paddocks, the white fences. So I'm paraphrasing now. Fred asked him about them sanitizing Alydar's stall within the first 20 hours, and Dixon swore that it wasn't an attempt to hide evidence. Okay, Kray pressed. What about them refusing insurance adjuster Terry McVeigh's entry? Dixon felt, well, there are two sides to every argument. Fred asked, quote, did you ever look at the latch at any time or take pictures to show whether it had been pulled out? Well, annoyed, Dixon said they were all more concerned with the horse than the damn bracket, so no. Had he noticed a mark on the stall door that was the likely kick involved in this? No, he had not pulled out a magnifying glass. He wasn't concerned with the door when a $30 million racehorse was injured, end quote. Wait, this is the insurance adjuster. Isn't that exactly what his job is when a $30 million horse is injured? Right? But to be fair, Tom did have a point that there were 3 veterinarians who all told him Alydar had kicked the door. Now, during another meeting, Tom revealed some new information. He and Dr. Bramblage had a prior relationship. Previously, they had worked together on another case, which explains why Dixon relied so heavily on this doctor's opinion. Dixon did permit Fred to examine the photos he had. And once again, nothing in the photos could be described as evidence that supported it being an accident. There was just nothing there. When asked about the maintenance man, Stanley Broughton, throwing away the corroded bolts while a $36 million claim was pending, Dixon first said, quote, on the face of it, they were trying to cover something up, end quote, and then backtracked immediately, saying that Calumet was just wiping away the memory of Alydar's loss. But wait, Alydar was still alive at that point and hadn't been lost. So what does that mean? I think he's hedging here, and I think he's just saying what pops into his head. Well, in February, to Fred's relief, Dixon sent all of his records, vet reports, photos, newspaper clippings, articles written on Alydar, the whole works. And Dixon's reports were invaluable. They were likely the most accurate, being written in real time as the events unfolded. Now listen, Tom Dixon is not a bad person. He is compassionate. I actually do believe he is honest. He just suffers from a lack of imagination. He allowed this regal history of Calumet to influence his investigation, never doubting when he was told it was an accident, much like Dr. Rhodes. He trusted those at Calumet, with his feelings, certainly upsetting at the same time, all conspiring to cloud his judgment. Confirmation bias ruled the day. If you believe it's an accident, you find ways to support this conclusion and you ignore anything to the contrary. Kray writes that in November 1990, Dixon simply didn't know what he didn't know. And I think that's a really true assessment. Fred's dissection of Dixon's reports, behavior, conclusion versus the reality is simply brilliant. And I could see the logic falling into place, sadly supporting the theory that Alydar was murdered. Follow the evidence and it will take you where you find yourself. So January 4th, 2019, find J.T. Lundy, who, it turns out, was living in his mother's modest one-story ranch. Angry at Fred's intrusion, Lundy was having none of it. And then Fred saw his demeanor shift, with Lundy apologizing that he really couldn't help him. The only thing that Kray learned, if Lundy had squirreled away cash, he wasn't living on it here. And Fred points this out about Lundy. Right after the trial, author Skip Hollandsworth ran into Lundy outside the courthouse, and he point blank asked Lundy if he had anything to do with Alydar's death. Lundy insisted he had not, that he loved that horse. Quote, "I'd give anything if Alydar was still at Calumet, heading off to his breeding shed." End quote. Wow. So once again, Lundy reveals his concern was Alydar, the ATM machine. It's all about breeding shed, breeding shed, breeding shed. Cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. If you recall, right after Alydar's surgery, Lundy asked how soon he'd be able to breed. He did not ask whether the horse was going to live or die. How soon can he get back to making the money in the breeding shed? Lundy is all about the money and finding a way to survive the financial debacle that he has created. Now, fun fact. Do you recall writer Skip Hollandsworth from my trilogy, The Midnight Assassin, episode 53 to 55? He is an amazing writer, and you should check them out if you haven't already. Well, next on Kray's list was speaking to Michael Coulter, Alydar's groom. A nervous defense witness, his testimony had added little at the time. Now, finding this guy's home proved to be a challenge even for Fred's GPS. And after a mighty backwoods directionally challenged struggle, Kray found Michael Coulter. He asked him to look over the court transcripts and Dixon's photos. Reflecting back on the trial, Coulter said that the questions he was asked didn't seem to be related to the case. Well, Fred questioned. Being Alydar's groom, he'd have reported in early the next morning. Had he spoken to Alton Stone? Taking a minute to think back, Coulter confirmed, saying Stone, quote, said he made the rounds and went to get something to eat. That's normal. And there was this little restaurant just a piece down the road, end quote. Wait. That's critical. Stone went off Calumet grounds to a restaurant. Well, yes, quote, he was gone a little longer than he meant to be, probably an hour, and he came back and found him in the stall, the bracket lying on the floor, and the stall was still closed because they'd latched it up there, end quote. Oh. No wonder Stone had lied and misled and changed his story. If he had admitted that he left the grounds that night, he'd have been fired, no question about it. Now, Kray judged this to be the closest he'd ever get to Stone's truth, that he had confided in someone he trusted right after the events had unfolded. They revisited the kicking the stall door theory and then the bracket. From the photo, Coulter also identified some Alydar-made marks on the stall door. His pawing when he wanted a carrot or attention, which mirrored Charlie Rose's comments at the time. Charlie was Alydar's training rider. Coulter insisted that Alydar's 5.5 to 6 inch hoof, which is 14 to 15.2 centimeters, that is, these hooves, couldn't fit between the door and the wall as it was claimed. And Coulter had looked for marks that would indicate this. And, quote, there wasn't any sign of it. If a horse had struggled for any period of time, the straw and the stuff under his feet is going to get kicked away. And the stall was like it always was, end quote. Then he surprised Fred again. Quote, even if he got his foot in there, he's not getting it out. That door is so heavy, it took 2 hands to open them. You could pull and pull and pull and never get it out, and you would leave a mark and blood. There was no blood. End quote. Fred's head was spinning. Did Michael Coulter know Alton Stone well? Well, it turns out he did. He and Alton had grown up together. Quote, I think somebody did it, knew Alton was going to be watching the stallion that night, and I think he got set up in the deal. I've known Alton since we were kids. It's just not in his nature to be part of anything like that. End quote. Fred listened intently, asking how Alydar might have been deliberately injured. Quote, easy. I seen a million of these x-rays. If he had kicked through the door and twisted it, this break would have been more of an angle. This is a straight across break. End quote. And Coulter is correct. Dr. Bramblage had drawn a diagram of the injury, showing the break as straight across the cannon bone. Fred raised the issue of them overbreeding Alydar, and that Dr. Rhodes was concerned with the management not reducing the number. Coulter grew grim. Quote, there was a time or two that we bred Alydar 4 times a day, and this would be late at night, like 9, 10 o'clock. They did those electrodes on his back stimulating with the soreness and the stiffness in his back from breeding so much. End quote. That poor horse. Well, next on Kray's list was Stanley Broughton. 30 years later, Fred thought that Stanley did not look well. He had been Calumet's maintenance guy, and he was very reluctant to speak with Fred, but he managed to coax Broughton into talking to him. Stanley told Fred that about 9 a.m. that day of the injury, he reported to J.T. Lundy, who told him to fix the bracket of the stall door. Now, this does not match his testimony in court back in the day, when he said Susan McGee had told him to replace the bracket. Well, Fred delved into what happened with the bolts. A flash of anger from Broughton deterred him, so he decided to circle back. Switching gears, Fred went into the farm's insolvency. Had Broughton known the farm was in financial meltdown? No, but he thought a living Alydar was better than a dead one. Had he ever had to repair Alydar's stall before? No, he had not. Fred referred to the bolts again, and what had he done with them, with Stanley dodging a direct response. Shifting to the door latch, he asked if it had been damaged. Quote, no, because the accident happened in the back end of the door, and that's where the roller was, end quote. And now Fred just forged ahead. Quote, so did you throw out the bolts that were in there before? Well, yes, because there was no use in keeping it to me, end quote. Had Lundy or anyone given him instructions to keep them for the adjuster or anything like that? No. Had he disturbed the other brackets? No, he had not. Now, Fred knew this statement was different from what Stanley had sworn in an affidavit during Lundy's fraud trial, that he had possibly disturbed the old bolts while fixing the bracket, but he wasn't sure. Did Stanley recall filing an affidavit for Lundy's fraud trial? No, he did not. And now Fred was concerned that his memory was slipping. This is 30 years later. Then Stanley recited a perfect version of the entanglement theory, and he believed it was an accident. Fred concluded that Stanley Broughton was a man who had worked for Calumet for 33 years and was loyal to his employers. He would never admit tossing away those corroded brackets was a problem. They parted with a firm handshake. Well, now Fred had to find a veterinarian who would discuss Alydar's injury, surgery, and death, and that would be terribly difficult. Once the name Dr. Larry Bramblage came up, doors shut. The man was revered in the equine world. Well, Fred thought perhaps he might find one in academia who would have an expert opinion on the x-rays and the facts of the case. At the University of California, Davis, a professor of veterinary anatomy, a tireless advocate for horse safety, and who had spent her life investigating the cause of catastrophic breakdowns in racehorses, with an expertise in prevention of musculoskeletal injuries in equine athletes was Dr. Susan Strover. She's freaking perfect. Calling Dr. Strover, she listened as he explained about the book, Alydar, that he wanted her opinion on cannon bone fracture. He filled her in on the entanglement theory, the circumstantial evidence, the soul, the bolts, the whole shebang. And she found it all interesting, saying that she didn't think she could help, but she asked for a copy of the X-ray. Later that day, her analysis arrived in Fred's inbox. It was her opinion that the X-ray, quote, did not rule out or rule in any injury from a crowbar or bat. From studies done on cadaveric equine cannon bones in compression and bending, there is evidence that forces in excess of 7,000 pounds would be required to cause breakage in a single event to an otherwise healthy bone, end quote. Well, Alydar was an amazing super horse, but not super enough to exert 7,000 pounds of force on his leg with a straight kick and leave no trace. And Dr. Strover confirmed that, yeah, it could be from a hit with a crowbar. It could be. Fred met with Alydar's previous groom, Paul Pryor. Michael Coulter had taken over for him. Paul told Fred that Alydar liked to play. He'd find a big mud puddle and roll in it, getting all muddy. And once, when he was hosing off Alydar, the horse grabbed him by the arm, and he could have pulled Paul's arm clear off. Paul asked Alydar, quote, "Are you going to let me go?" End quote, spraying him a bit, and he let him go. All right, well, what about Alydar's temperament? Did he have fits? Paul snorted. He was like any other horse. He'd play, smart as a whip. He would bite, and he loved his carrots, but he wasn't a kicker. He looked over the photos of the stall, pointing at what he thought was likely Alydar's toe, leaving a mark. No way had the accident happened as they described. He couldn't imagine a scenario where he'd kick hard enough to break a cannon bone. Paul also confirmed they were overbreeding Alydar, and when he said it too often, Paul got fired. He had told J.T. Lundy, quote, "If you put a bag of carrots here and a mare there, J.T., where do you think Alydar would go?" End quote. And when he had heard that Alydar had to be put down, the man struggled to keep his composure, barely succeeding. Quote, "I thought the worst, and I was hoping I was wrong. I thought JT would do anything for money." End quote. Well, in 1987, arch rival Affirmed was moved from Spendthrift Farm to Calumet, and he was struggling to adjust to the new environment. His groom, Gregory Clark, joined Affirmed there to help ease the transition. Of Calumet, Clark thought that the horses needed to be let out more. It was like they were caged. Clark knew Lundy thought that they were too valuable to be allowed out at night, and truth was Alydar was still being pimped out at 10 p.m. But to not have a guard in the stallion barn all night was crazy, Clark said. Could Affirmed and Alydar been bickering and caused the accident? Clark was somewhat confused by the question. Well, no, they wouldn't have had visual contact, so it doesn't make sense that in the middle of the night, one of the horses got upset. Another thing Clark was troubled by was the grooming staff's lack of experience. Bribing a horse with a carrot is not a good training model, and Clark tried to break Alydar from the carrots, but being smart, Alydar caught on and would get pissed when he'd see Clark coming. Clark had seen him kick with his front feet, getting aggravated without his carrot. But Alydar was a ham, loved preening for photographs. He knew he was the king of the castle, and he loved listening to TV. Well, I mean, what TV shows did he like listening to? I mean, I immediately thought Mr. Ed, but who knows, right? Anyway, was Alydar fractious and difficult to control? No, he was just smart, and he figured out humans and how to get his way. He knew when they were going to the vet and when he was going to get a shot. No horse likes that. What about this entanglement theory? Clark did not see how it was possible. There would have been some indentation in the door. Did a friend and Alydar race each other at Calumet? Quote, absolutely. They'd run up and down there. That happened all the time. Every day they would run the fence lines. It was kind of neat. End quote. Yeah, that really would have been with no cameras and lights and bells going off and starting gates. I would have loved to have seen that. Now, finding a former FBI agent is not easy, but Fred did make contact with Robert Foster. Any files that the FBI had on Alydar had been destroyed around 2006. And then Foster vanished. All Fred knew was that the man was working in Los Angeles. Now, coincidentally, Fred was in Los Angeles for a family wedding, and he left a voicemail, hoping Foster would call back. And he did. The problem that the FBI had with the Alydar investigation was by the time they got to look into it, the statute of limitations had passed. They had no choice but to charge Lundy with bank fraud. They discussed Alton Stone and the new information from Michael Coulter about him going off to go eat in a local restaurant. And Foster believed that Stone had gotten stuck in a lie, hamstrung by what Susan McGee told him to say, and Stone had stuck to the story, reworking it to fit reality, coming up a perjurer. It is really quite sad. Fred asked, had they found out where Lundy was when Alydar was injured? No. The lights were on in the office above the stall, which was somewhat unusual, and then later, Lundy just showed up. They reviewed Pratt's testimony about the force causing the break coming from outside the stall, meaning the bracket had to have been sawed or chiseled off. And Foster agreed, quote, the theory that he kicked the door or his leg got stuck in the door are virtually impossible, end quote. The door just couldn't be opened wide enough and leave the latch intact. The FBI conclusion was that Lundy or some other unknown person had killed Alydar. They suspected that Alydar's right foot was brought through the stall door and tied to a rope, the rope tied to a truck, the horse fell over and broke his leg. The bracket was sawed off from the outside and the roller bracket put in the middle of the corridor, staging the scene. Lundy was there that night, and it's highly suspicious that his whereabouts was not revealed by Lundy. Foster theorized, quote, because of the significance and because how much this would be viewed by everyone, I don't think Lundy would have involved anybody that didn't absolutely have to be involved. I don't think he wanted anyone to know. I think this was something he despised, truthfully. But I think he was out of options. He was probably sick about it, end quote. Well, we might disagree there. I think Lundy was sick about losing his stud fees. And you know my opinion. Kathy Jones, J.T. Lundy's sister, was the equine insurance agent who Fred viewed as smart, likable, and witty, but with some blind spots. Fred wanted to know if J.T. was in over his head. Growing philosophical, Kathy said that when questions like this arise, follow the money. None of it went to her brother. It all went to the bank. She said that the night of Alydar's injury, J.T. called her screaming, cursing that Alydar had broken his fucking leg and to get over to the farm. And from her window, Jones saw J.T., quote, zoom down the driveway like a bat out of Hades, end quote. Whoa. So wait. This is the first time there was any evidence that anyone saw Lundy leave his farm to go to Calumet that night. This is important. All right, Kathy had been stuck with JT owing her millions of dollars from the money she had paid towards insurance premiums for him, and he never paid her back. Now living in a house that Kathy inherited from her mother, he lived there day to day with her paying the bills. She adamantly believed that JT had nothing to do with Alydar's death, and he told her that the horse was keeping the farm going, but admitted, quote, maybe somebody did do it, but I don't know who it would have been, end quote. She also said that Alydar was aggressive, a biter, and a kicker. Now, this is something I have wondered about. Why had she asked for immunity when she testified? Well, she said, look, only an idiot would talk to federal investigators without it. Quote, all you have to do is tell an investigator that somebody wore a pink shirt on Tuesday when they didn't, and now you've lied to a federal officer, end quote.
Yeah.
Well, I cannot deny the accuracy of her statement, and I think she was probably pretty smart. I also don't think she knew anything about what happened in that stall that night on November 13th, 1990. Veterinarian Dr. Linda Rhodes Stewart was next on the interview list. Driving up to a fenced, immaculate horse farm, he actually crossed paths with the doctor in her gated driveway. Learning why he was there, Linda Rhodes Stewart frowned. Fred kept talking that he'd interviewed so-and-so, and Dr. Rhodes Stewart asked if he had interviewed Sandy Hatfield. Flinching inwardly, Fred explained that he had tried, but Hatfield refused. He added, quote, "She says she doesn't remember anything," end quote. With a decided lack of conviction, Dr. Rhodes Stewart said she would meet with him the next day. Sensing her hesitancy and fearing she might cancel on him, Fred asked quickly, had she thought the groom was involved? And she said she didn't know. Quote, "Stoney called me on the phone and said, 'Doc, I saw a little blood in Alydar's stall. Could you come check it out when you get a chance?' End quote. And she was incredulous still that such a dire injury had occurred, and Stone was so blasé about it. But now she had to go assist with the foaling, so they parted. And Dr. Rhodes Stewart did cancel that meeting with Fred, so it was good he'd gotten that much out of her. It all came down to Dr. Bramblage with his sterling reputation and prominence in the field. At the time, he'd proclaimed Alydar had suffered an accident. After that, Dr. Baker and Dr. Rhodes Stewart fell in line with Tom Dixon on board, and no one wanted a more detailed investigation, especially J.T. Lundy. Dixon's vanilla reports raised no red flags, and Lloyd's paid the claim, never asking for more details. Fred watched Dr. Bramblage in an ESPN Sports Century Affirmed versus Alydar interview. The doctor was impeccably dressed, friendly, knowledgeable, warm. And this was not the man who sat down to talk with Fred Kray, not even close. Instead of meeting in Bramblige's office, without an introduction or handshake, Bramblage sat in a chair in the admissions office, which was an open area where clients were waiting for his staff to attend their needs. This was clearly not a welcomed meeting. Bramblage said, quote, "Go ahead," end quote. With permission to record, Fred got directly to the point. He'd read all the reports. Dr. Rhodes Stewart, Alydar kicked the stall wall and door. Dr. Baker, he kicked the stall door. Calamet's press release, he kicked the stall door. Dr. Bramblage first said, quote, "The horse kicked the stall door probably because he was just feeling good," end quote. Bramblage just skipped right over the implication and went to say that there were 1,000 hoof prints in that stall. Refreshing the doctor on what his report said, Bramblage impatiently agreed, saying, quote, "He kicked through the stall door, broke the roller off, his leg got caught. He couldn't get his leg back out. He slipped and fell and bent the leg and broke the cannon bone because it was caught," end quote. It was obvious what the horse did, causing a low-energy fracture. Well, Fred replied that the problem is that there is no evidence of that happening. No marking the door, nothing reflected in the photos. Fred had spoken to all the grooms, the farmhands, the maintenance guy. There was nothing beyond that broken bracket. Nodding, Dr. Bramblage agreed. Yes, the bracket was broken, which was why he was able to get his foot out from between the door and wall, dodging the lack of physical evidence entirely. Did Dr. Bramblage know the bracket was corroded? Well, he never looked at the bracket. He was caring for the horse. Taking out Tom Dixon's photographs, Fred pointed to the door with no fresh indentations or marks. Quote, "How much force do you think it would take for a horse to kick a 300-pound door out far enough to break a cannon bone?" That's about 136 kilograms, by the way. Sighing, Bramblage explained that it didn't break when he kicked it. His foot slid in between. But, Based on what evidence, doctor? Bramblage insisted that the fracture was low energy, meaning high weight, a slow force application. Fred switched tactics. Was Dr. Bramblage familiar with Dr. Susan Stover? Oh, yes, she was a good friend, very qualified. Fred told Bramblage that her opinion was that you couldn't rule out a baseball bat or crowbar fracture, which strikes at the heart of this accident theory. Frowning, Bramblage said emphatically that he disagreed with Dr. Stover and maligned her decision-making ability, when just moments before he said she was a good friend and highly qualified. Interesting shift. Fred switched gears, addressing the undamaged latch. He described the mechanics of the stall door, with Dr. Bramblage interjecting here and there, insisting a horse of his size could get his foot 3 feet up and his 5.5-inch hoof out and in between. Fred pressed, but wouldn't there be physical evidence this happened? Bramblage asked, well, what evidence would you look for? Quote, the door weighed 300 pounds, so when it came down and trapped his hoof, it's going to mark that red paint. It's going to mark the wall where he's supposed to be struggling. Adjuster Terry McVeigh came out to the stall the next day, and there was no evidence that there was an accident at all, not on the walls or the stall door. John Ward and everybody else has said there should be marks inside that door, and there's not, end quote. Dr. Bramblage insisted there were thousands of marks. True, but none fresh from Alydar. Bramblage rehashed the same story of the hoof getting stuck, ignoring the devastating lack of evidence to support his theory, tension ratcheting up. Bramblage insisted, quote, there's 1,000 of them. He wailed away at the stall door. If you talk to his groom, end quote, with Fred interjecting, I did talk to his grooms. Bramblage snapped, quote, if he's not the first horse out, or if another horse went to the breeding shed, not him, he would wail away at the stall door, end quote. Wait, what? What had Bramblage said? Bramblage hadn't met Alydar until after he was injured. How could he speak to Alydar's behavior going into the breeding shed? I think the good doctor is triggered. I think he's arrogant and he's not accustomed to anyone questioning and challenging his opinions. Well frazzled from the difficulty of this interview, Fred asked who told him this, and Bramblage said he'd heard this from his grooms, with Fred pressing, and Michael Coulter was named. Fred pressed again, telling Bramblage Coulter told him Alydar left front paw marks, and Bramblage insisted that they were rear marks. Okay, when had Bramblage decided that this had happened and was an accident? Well, after looking at the x-rays of the fracture, and after the surgery when they were waiting for Alydar to recover from the anesthesia. Then how come this isn't written in his report to Lloyd's, nor is this in any of the other doctors' reports by the veterinarians who were actually caring for Alydar? Bramblage said he'd only written about the fracture and repair. He had not speculated about how it happened. Then they went into a spin about who thought it was an accident. Bramblage, Tom Dixon, Dr. Rhodes, Dr. Baker, and those who did not, basically everybody else that worked closely with Alydar. Bramblage challenged the intentional injury theory. Quote, if you're going to break a bone with a crowbar, you would not pick the right hind. That would be the hardest one to break. Unless you've got 2 people in the stall with someone to restrain him, you'd never get a shot at the right hind leg, end quote. Well, why couldn't 2 people in the stall be doing exactly that, which would leave no evidence behind, Fred wondered. Fred now mentioned John Ward's theory of the maiming of Alydar, which Bramblage rejected, saying it was too difficult to hold a horse in place, leaving his leg trapped and struggling, even though Ward's theory had the same torquing twist to the bone as Bramlage's. Fred rattled off the damning information he'd collected. The guard asked to take the night off by management the same night the injury occurs. Adjusters not being allowed in the next morning. Stanley Broughton asked to make repairs immediately, throwing out evidence. Inconsistent stories of how the horse was found. X-ray and medical records disappearing. No evidence inside the stall at all. But Dr. Bramlage was unshakable, rejecting the concept that it was a deliberate act. He pointed out that anyone who knew horses would know that rear leg bones are tough, very tough, and they'd never choose a rear hind leg. Okay, so what if a person didn't know anything about horse bones? Bramlage proclaimed that Alydar would have gotten him before he would have gotten the horse. Well, Fred was entirely exasperated by now, and the interview was just over. Just a prickly guy, and I conclude there was no way this famous expert veterinarian, after he had announced to the world it was an accident, repeating this a dozen times or more, that he would lose face and admit he might be wrong. It is just not happening. Now, Fred immediately called Michael Coulter. And no, he had never spoken to Dr. Bramlage, and Alydar was getting older. Quote, he certainly wasn't wailing around eager to go to the breeding shed. He was worn out and didn't care. And they never took him out first. They started at the end of the barn and they worked their way to the front, end quote. Utterly refuting what Dr. Bramlage had said. It was puzzling. Bramlage had cited the groom as his source, knowing full well that Fred could verify what was what, and this was not verified. Well, then came 2020, and the pandemic kicked into swing, casting its long shadow of death across the world, and it impacted Fred. Loss is difficult, grief is painful. Recall, our loved ones were left in hospitals alone in a futile attempt to stem the spread of the virus. They died alone, confused, frightened, and no funerals were permitted either. And this entire situation was simply awful. Fred's personal struggle during this era is really heartbreaking. And knowing the facts, I cannot fathom what he and so many others endured. He lost his motivation to write, not caring if he ever finished the book. As Fred was grieving, he leaned on his mentor, author Anne Hagdorn Allback. She encouraged him, reinvigorated him, helped him to regain his confidence in a drive to complete the book. Finding his motivation once again, Fred vowed to complete it for Alydar, who deserved to have the truth told. Auerbach shared a story with Fred. When she was writing Wild Ride, she wanted to speak with Lyle Roby, who is Calamate's attorney and a financial advisor to the Wright heirs. In 1992, Lyle Roby called Anne to share information, but wanted to talk in person, not over the phone. Meeting arranged, Roby fell into a coma and died, and Anne never learned what he wanted to share with her. Now, what was missing from Fred's research was a perspective of someone who actually killed horses. Well, a daunting thought, right? Well, veterinarians certainly are important experts. Short of humanely putting them down as necessary, they didn't run around killing horses. Well, in October 2021, on Netflix's Bad Sports series, a man known as the Sandman, Tommy Burns, was interviewed, speaking about killing 15 to 20 horses for the insurance money. Well, eager to speak to this guy, Fred tracked him down, feeling somewhat queasy about meeting this man. If you watch this episode 5 on Bad Sport on Netflix, the episode is called Horse Hitman, and you get all the details from Tommy Burns himself, and it is disturbing. So Tommy Burns is a burly man, bright blue eyes, outdoorsman kind of guy, who was open and honest, not at all what Fred was expecting. A street urchin grown into a petty criminal to horse assassin, he said, quote, "It's an awful fucking thing to think about. These animals didn't deserve this. It was a rotten fucking thing to do, and I'm the first to admit it. It was pretty cowardly. I pretty much got drunk, got in my own mind zone, and did it," end quote, as his eyes filled up with tears. Giving him Dixon's photographs, they discussed Dr. Pratt, John Ward, and Dr. Bramlage's theories on Alydar's death. Focusing on the unbroken latch, Burns told Fred it would have pulled out if kicked with that kind of force. The expert, Burns theorized that someone would break the horse's leg in the stall. It would conceal what was happening from anyone who happened to be walking by, and the horse couldn't get away. The broken bracket was just for show to lead people to think there'd been some monstrous kick. The thing was, there's no way to get that kind of speed necessary in a stall. Quote, "My opinion is that somebody made this look like a staged crime scene. That's what it is," end quote. And it worked. People largely bought the kick the stall theory. And this is coming from a professional horse killer, so I tend to believe him. Tommy said that if he had broken Alydar's leg, he would have thrown a blanket over his head. His accomplice, someone he trusted implicitly, would make sure that no one was around. Quote, "In this stall, you've got a crowbar and a guy holding the horse's head. Then whoosh, a big blow, like hitting it with a 2x4. Then you make it look like his leg got stuck, breaking off the roller bracket, and get the hell out of there." I mean, without the roller bracket, how did he break his leg? Standing in a stall? Impossible. And if he'd broken his leg getting it stuck in the door, his leg would look like Hamburger Helper. Blood-chipped paint, a big mess. He looked at the photos of the stall door. That's front feet, not rear, end quote. At this point, I am fairly certain that Alydar pawed with his front feet on the stall door to get his carrot. I think we can say that for a fact. Now, Lester Munson and Bill Knack wrote the Sports Illustrated article Blood Money, with the sidebar wondering about Alydar's death. Knack had died in the interim years, but Munson was now about 80 years old. Thrilled to talk, he told Fred they created a timeline that followed the financial house of cards falling down, the bankruptcy looming, and it became obvious that banker Frank Sehack had to be involved. Knack always believed that Alydar had been murdered. Well, strange place for a fun fact, but Bill Knack was one of the best turf writers ever, and it is he who wrote the definitive biography of Secretariat, the Triple Crown winner, and his license plate was Alydar. That's pretty cool. Fred learned that 3 men attended Alydar's funeral, which had been put together in haste: Robert Fox, John Secura, and Alan Crutchkoff. Well, who are these guys? A horse breeder from Canada, John Secura had died in a mysterious car fire while parked outside his home. Yeah, weird, right? Robert Fox and Alan Crutchkoff were partners in the Associated Thoroughbred Projects, who sold many of Alydar's breeding rights, making millions in commissions, including their own free breeding rights to Calumet stallions. Alan Crutchkoff was now in his 70s and had expunged his relationship to anything Alydar or Calumet. Fred found him and asked him why he'd attended the horse's funeral. Well, it turns out that he, Secura, and Robert Fox, who is also now deceased, were consultants and friends of Lundy's. Crutchkoff insisted that Alydar's death was natural, as he was cast in his stall. So, casting. All right, casting is when a horse lies on his side and is unable to get his legs underneath him to raise himself back up, because maybe his legs are too close to the stall door or wall. Now, this configuration would cause the horse to panic and injure himself. Now, no one in all of this has even hinted at casting as a cause, but Alan brought it up, so I figured I'd mention it. Alan angrily insisted that Lundy would never hurt a flea. Well, Fred tried to get into some detail, with Alan deflecting. He didn't know anything. But then he admitted that he and Robert Fox were on the farm the night Alydar died, with Fred nearly falling out of his chair. Why were they there? Well, because Alan was a friend, loved animals, and the racing traditions. Quote, "I was at the funeral because I loved Alydar, and I held his ear because I loved the horse," end quote. What? Oh, okay. All right, the final chapter in Broken is Fred delivering a closing argument. Summarizing all that is known of Alydar's death 30 years later, it is simply devastating as he flexes all of his lawyering skills to the max. There are 2 sides, Dixon, Bramblage, Baker, Rhodes Stewart, who believe the entanglement theory, that broke the strongest, densest bone in a horse's body, while devoid of any evidence of such happening, save for the broken bracket. Lloyd's paid the claim, believing it was caused by a direct kick, wholly unsupported by evidence. On the other side, you have Calumet's financial turmoil. Cowboy Kip told to take the night off, with Crutchcoff admitting that he, Robert Fox, and John Sakira were on the property the same night. Coincidence? In September, Golden Eagle announces it's not reviewing the $5 million policy. October, First City gave Calumet a loan with a huge February 28, 1991 payment looming or go into default. Around November 6, 1990, the decision to kill Alydar was made. Alton Stone, the one convicted, had nothing to do with this as he was off-site having dinner. Evidence Alydar was intentionally injured is overwhelming. One, the utter lack of evidence that it was an accident. No fresh kick marks, no chipped paint, no disturbed stall, no disturbed hay, no broken latch, the lack of enough blood to support this kind of break. Stone, Coulter, McVeigh, Broughton all confirmed that there were no marks on the stall door. Susan Hatfield says she saw marks, but they are absent from Dixon's photos. Dixon said there was an opening, but never photographs it, never reports it to Lloyd's. It's not there. Has any reason ever been put forth as to why Alydar, quiet in his stall, suddenly is kicking, applying 12,000 pounds of pressure to that door? None have stood up. None. Cowboy Kip was told to take the night off by a man in Lundy's Crown Victoria, a man seen in the office with Lundy previously. Susan McGee tells maintenance man Stanley Broughton to fix the bracket in the early morning the next day. Evidence is thrown away. Coincidence? Lundy knew all of this, and he cites 3 different versions of what happened in this very pristine stall, based on the photographs. That insurance adjuster Terry McVeigh was denied entry into Calumet until after the stall was repaired? More coincidence? Is it a coincidence that Calumet's finances were cascading out of control the very time Alydar was injured? Insurance policies worth $41.5 million were being canceled shortly. Bramlage's entanglement theory cannot be proven as there's no evidence supporting it, saying for the one bracket found 6 to 8 feet away in the stallion barn aisle. Dr. Pratt's idea that a rope was tied around Alydar's leg, then pulled by the farm equipment that no one saw, is not supported. It's just too involved. Ward's theory of holding Alydar's leg jammed between the stall door and wall, letting him struggle to break the leg, is possible. But would these killers twiddle for 10 minutes when Stone might actually return? Unlikely. The most believable theory is that of experienced horse killer Tommy Burns, who had seen this happen before. Alydar was hit with a crowbar. 3 vets deny this is possible, clinging to the entanglement theory with no evidence. However, neutral Dr. Susan Strover said it was possible and could not be ruled out by the X-rays. In Dr. Baker's report, he wrote that Alydar had a silver dollar-sized wound on his leg, which is also consistent with a possible crowbar strike. Whacking off the corroded bolts would be an easy accomplishment with a crowbar as well. And recall, metal shavings were found by Dr. Pratt when examining the bolts, which showed an external shearing force toward the inside of the stall, so not originating in the stall from Alydar. In Lundy's trial, it couldn't be proven that he orchestrated the death of Alydar. Fred Kray cannot tell you who gave the order and did this heinous deed either. Kathy Jones, Lundy's sister, suggested one follows the money, and doing so can provide some answers. Financial motive. In the aftermath of Alydar's death, Calumet received $1 million, plus 50% of its debt to First City was paid off, which would make the Japanese investors more interested, according to Gary Matthews. CHAC. Wheeling and dealing loans to Lundy, breeding rights manipulation, bribery, etc., that resulted in both men being convicted of fraud. Neither Seahack or Lundy ever talked, and Lundy died December 23, 2023, after a fall resulting in a head wound. At one point, Lundy's sister, Kathy Jones, suggested he write a book, and he responded, quote, "As long as Cindy's alive and my children, I don't know. I don't want to make them upset about things or something," end quote. Lundy never asked if Alydar would live or about the horse's welfare after the broken leg. He only inquired about his ability to get back in the breeding shed and make him money. Quote, "Who made the decision Alydar had to be killed, and who actually performed this terrible act? It could be argued that it was Seahack," end quote, writes Fred Kray. He told Fred he was still at the bank when Alydar was injured. Anne Hagdorn Auerbach has said, quote, "I think JT basically got in over his head. I've always believed that if he knew, he really didn't want it to happen," end quote. What was essential was Calumet's cover-up. It was the path to the insurance payouts. Quote, "First City got the vast majority of money, half of Calumet's debt, far more than Calumet received, which was likely designed deliberately by Seahack, the significant financial motive." Quote, "Based on all the evidence, it is not hard to conclude that Seahack ordered the killing and Lundy was forced to go along and help cover it up. Seahack was the mastermind of looting First City. He was an experienced fraudster, and ordering the killing of a horse for the payoff was right in his wheelhouse," end quote. Fred writes eloquently as he continues to make this case based on the evidence, and I urge you to read the book, because it is in reality a moving tribute to Alydar, who had his life snuffed out far too soon. He remembers the proud, beautiful Alydar who, quote, "did everything that was asked of him during his racing career and at stud. Remember him as a horse that raced a firm with all he had every time, becoming the top sire in 1990 and finding Triple Crown redemption in his sons Ali Sheba and Easy Goer," end quote. I've abbreviated this part of Fred's closing because it brought me to tears, which this book has done a lot since I began this series, and I couldn't do more or risk melting down at the mic again. If you buy the book, there is a code that can be used to complete the jury form, where you can share your now learned opinion with Fred Kray on what happened to Alydar, who did what and why. I filled it out, and it helped in feeling somewhat satisfied, even though this remains an unsolved cold case. But this is a brilliant part of this book. Now, I can't resist. This is second cast. So I have to look into Tommy Burns's crimes, who he worked for, and what the outcome was. So Tommy Burns is the horse serial killer that I've mentioned, and he admits to killing 15 to 20 horses. For a decade, Burns had been electrocuting horses for their owners, enabling them to collect rich insurance payouts on their show horses. From William Knack's article on this, Tommy Burns said, quote, "They go down immediately. One horse dropped so fast in the stall he must have broken his neck when he hit the floor. It's a sick thing, I know, but it was quick and it was painless. They didn't suffer," end quote. And the diagnosis would be death from colic. But in February 1991, this lucrative scam took an ugly turn when Burns told federal investigators that elite show horse owner Donna Brown had hired him to kill her horse Streetwise. The problem was Brown's insurance policy didn't cover colic, so she needed Tommy to break her horse's leg, bad enough that a vet would have to euthanize the horse. Now, this is rough even for Tommy, and he didn't want to do it. Enter Tommy's friend, Harlow Arley, who volunteered to break the horse's leg. It was raining that night, and the plan was to say this was an accident that the horse slipped in the rain as he was about to be transported. Arlie picked up the crowbar, slamming it into the leg of the stunned horse, who let out a startled, panicked cry of pain. Observing this macabre scene were agents from Florida's Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services who watched in horror. Burns now called Donna Brown, who ran an equestrian training center in Connecticut, and then who called a local vet and her insurance agent. Streetwise was put down as soon as the vet arrived, sparing the animal further suffering. The Florida Highway Patrol picked up Burns shortly after leaving the scene. Clamming up at first, Tommy initially didn't cooperate when he talked to the FBI. Burns was persuaded to name names after listening to a recording of his mentor, a father figure he had looked up to for 20 years, Barney Ward, arranging for Tommy Burns to be killed. Heartbroken, Tommy testified before the grand jury. Harlow Arlie pled guilty to charges of insurance fraud and cruelty to animals, and he eventually served 6 months of an 18-month sentence before being paroled. Donna Brown would plead guilty to wire fraud, only admitting to have overstated Streetwise's purchase price on insurance papers. She paid $7,500 for the horse, and he was insured for $25,000. She would serve 90 days, far too lenient to my way of thinking. Another Brown horse, Aramis, had also died under mysterious circumstances. One of America's elite horsemen, at age 31, was George Lindemann Jr., from one of America's wealthiest families, and he was investigated, arrested, and tried for his role in the death of his show horse, Charisma. In December 1990, a month after Alydar's death, Tommy Burns would testify against Lindemann, saying he'd electrocuted the horse at Lindemann's estates in Armonk, New York. Charisma had been insured for $250,000, and minus Tommy's fee of $35,000, it was still a chunk of change, but not that much for a rich guy. But U.S. Attorney James Burns compared Lindemann to a, quote, a very wealthy kid that has a toy he doesn't like, or gets mad at, or throws it on the floor and stomps on it, end quote. Speaking to reporters about George Lindemann, Tommy Burns said, quote, he had a horse that he thought was going to be a champion horse, and it turned out to be a dismal failure. And he hated the horse, like the expensive toy he's got to get rid of, end quote. Disgusted by this whole sordid affair, Judge Marovich told Lindemann, quote, this whole case demonstrated unmitigated arrogance, end quote, and sentenced Lindemann to 33 months in prison, fining him $500,000, plus pay restitution of $250,000 and the cost of imprisonment. Defense attorney Dan Webb asked that Lindemann remain free pending his appeal, with Judge Marovich rejecting this.
Yes.
Appealing all the way to the Supreme Court, Lindemann lost and would serve 18 months. Another equestrian, owner of Acre Wild Farm in Rhode Island, Paul Valieri, who admitted he paid $5,000 to have his horse, Rousseau Platier, electrocuted, collecting the $75,000 insurance payout. He'd been having financial problems, and Rousseau Platieri had been a bad investment. Connecting with Rhode Island expert rider Barney Ward, Ward made the arrangements with Tommy Burns for the horse to be killed. Later, Paul began working for the government, which saw his sentence reduced to 4 years probation, plus a $5,000 fine. And Barney Ward. Indicted too, Barney would plead guilty to conspiracy and was sentenced to 33 months in prison for arranging the killing of 4 show horses. Restitution of $200,000 to the American Livestock Insurance Company for his role in the death of a 5th horse was sent. Barney also received a lifetime suspension from the U.S. Equestrian Federation, never to see his son compete. Barney Ward died of cancer in May 2012. Now, this barely scratches the surface of the horse murder scandals, In all, 40 people were indicted. Guilty pleas and convictions were largely possible because Tommy Burns decided to work with federal prosecutors. In the end, Tommy Burns was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in prison in relation to Streetwise's death. He stated, quote, "I feel terrible about what I did, but I didn't advertise. I did not do any sales calls. People found me and came to me. Very important people, very wealthy people," end quote. After serving 6 months, Tommy was paroled. Today he lives in Florida, running an auto parts store, and has a horse farm, according to Cinemaholic. Wrapping up. In Broken, Fred Kray writes that one reason he wrote the book was to reach out to the public. As always, someone knows something. Someone out there can help solve horse racing's oldest, coldest case. Fred also has a podcast that accompanies his book, and I think you would benefit greatly from listening to it. I certainly did. The URL is on my blog, but here it is, www.brokenthepodcast.com. Fred has also written a brand new epilogue that is now included with Broken, and I found myself in tears again, wuss that I am. It's truly poetic as Fred lives the dream of a lifetime in publishing his tribute to this beloved racehorse, Alydar. Do not miss my follow-up interview with Fred Kray, episode 97, Theriacide, where Fred shares what he didn't include in the book. And I love it when the authors let us peek behind the curtain. I really recommend you read this book. It's very different from our usual true crime books. And let me know what you think. How was Alydar injured? Was it an accident or murder? I'm looking forward to your emails. And my next book is In My DNA, published in 2022 by Lindsay Wade. This book is about her 21-year law enforcement career that was largely motivated by horrifying crimes against young women and young girls that impacted her as a child and ignited her relentless pursuit of justice for victims. In My DNA isn't about a single case, but delves into shocking sex crimes and homicides in the Tacoma region of Washington state, and I find this to be really compelling. Thank you for listening, Murder Bookies. I see you as you hear me. I'm making a few changes to the podcast in the upcoming weeks, so let me know if you've noticed. And take a few minutes to leave an awesome review that helps me make new Murder Bookies. Share this podcast with a friend. Make your family listen. I can be reached at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com, on X, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and on YouTube. And you can always join Patreon for $4 a month. Enjoy, and I'll see you next week. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.